For the third election in a row, Donald Trump once again outperformed all the polls, even though polling data this time, for the very first time, did have him winning the election. He still performed much better than expected. And so in this video, we'll be taking a look at how Trump outperformed the polls all across the map. I mean, there really are some glaring examples. Just look at Illinois, where Kamala Harris was on track to win by nearly 20 points. She ultimately carried the state by just 9, and there are many other instances just like this. And so we'll start off out west, slowly move our way up to the Midwest, the Northeast, and finally the Deep South. And so beginning in the Silver State, Kamala Harris was on track to lose by 0.6%. It was supposed to be a tilt margin of victory for Donald Trump, but ultimately he came out ahead by 3.8%. Atlas Intel has once again been one of the most accurate pollsters in the entire country. They were incredibly close in 2020. They were actually the most accurate national pollster, and now on the statewide level, they have proven themselves as well. And so Nevada is going to be tilt red based on the polling data, but the final results, of course, have moved it up into the lean category, with Trump becoming the first Republican to win the Silver State in 20 years. Next up in Arizona, Donald Trump was on track to win by 2.8. It was going to be a pretty big margin considering that he lost Arizona entirely in 2020. Today, he is ahead by double that margin. We don't have all the votes in yet. There's around 70% of the votes from Arizona having been counted so far. Trump leads by 5.5. Ultimately, the margin is probably going to go down to somewhere in the 4 to 5 point range, so it is going to fall into the lean category, but still quite an impressive performance. Trump is going to outperform his margin from 2016 when he defeated Hillary Clinton in Arizona by 3.5 points, and this really is quite surprising considering that the general narrative has been that Arizona has been shifting more and more to the left every single election cycle. And so based on both the polls and what the final results are probably going to be, Arizona will be lean Republican, but this is yet another example of Trump performing better than predicted. Moving on to Colorado and New Mexico, the polls were actually surprisingly accurate in Colorado. They had Kamala Harris winning by 11.5%. She ultimately won by 11.4%, although Colorado is a state that shifted the most to the left over the last 20 years. So basically, from the election of George W. Bush all the way until Joe Biden, no state shifted further in favor of the Democratic Party than Colorado. That's probably one of the main reasons why Kamala Harris's underperformance of Biden wasn't as significant in the state. For context, Biden won Colorado by 13.5, and so based on both the polling and the final results, the state is going to be likely blue. The vice president's performance in New Mexico really was quite shameful, though. Joe Biden won it by 10.8% 4 years ago. Today, Harris wins New Mexico by less than half that. She won it by just 5.1. She underperformed the polls. The polls had her winning by 6.7, so she was already on track for a disappointing margin of victory, but somehow she did even worse. And this is the issue here. Democrats simply haven't been performing well with Latino voters. Trump won the largest share of Latino voters in 40 years, and that was one of the main reasons why Trump was able to win the popular vote and do so well. He gained significantly with minorities, and so New Mexico is barely going to be a likely blue state. Her margin was just above the 5-point threshold. Coming on down to Texas now, Trump outperformed the polls by 5%. That really is quite significant. They had him winning by 9 points. Trump ultimately won by 14. I mean, this is a state that the former president carried by 5.6% in 2020. It was nearly a 10-point swing in favor of the Republicans. Trump single-handedly stopped this shift to the left that Texas has been experiencing over the last 2 decades, and if he is able to preserve Texas for the GOP, Trump is going to be handing them election victories for the foreseeable future, and so the Lone Star State is going to be solid blue, even though nobody expected it. Next up, in the 2nd District of Maine, disappointment once again strikes the Kamala Harris campaign. She was on track to win by a double-digit margin, but ultimately she only carried the district by 4%. I mean, this district was literally made to be more more liberal after the 2021 redistricting process, and somehow she performed worse than Joe Biden, who won the district by 7 points 4 years prior. And so the second district of Nebraska, it was supposed to be likely maybe even solid blue, but ultimately it was only lean for our vice president. Moving up now to the Midwest, Trump performed better in this region than anywhere else in the entire country. I mean, the Midwest has never looked as red as it does today, going all the way back 40 years. And so beginning in Tim Walz's home state of Minnesota, Kamala Harris actually outperforms expectations, winning by 4.2%. The polls had her up by 4, so basically the polling was actually pretty much spot on, but many people did expect her to outperform this average, considering that this is Tim Walz's home state. He won re-election as governor by 15 points in 2022. Even Joe Biden won Minnesota by 7% 4 years ago, but just like everywhere else, Kamala Harris disappointed. Minnesota is going to be lean blue based both on the polling and on the final results. In Iowa, we actually had a really big story come out of here when that Des Moines Register poll, this was a Seltzer poll, it showed Kamala Harris leading by 3%. Ultimately, of course, this poll was proven wrong. Donald Trump won Iowa by 14%, which means that Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register underestimated Donald Trump, who won the state, by the way, by 8 points in both of the last two elections. They underestimated him by a whopping 17 percentage points. I mean, how bad of a pollster do you have to be to mess things up like that? But they had the reputation of being the most accurate. Obviously, they will never regain that after this. And so Iowa, it was supposed to be lean blue based on the best poll we thought we had, but ultimately it was solid red. In Wisconsin, this is one of the places where the polling average actually had the result just completely wrong. Kamala Harris was supposed to win by 0.4%, but ultimately Trump, just like he does everywhere else, he outperformed expectations, winning by 0.8%. I did say Wisconsin would be one of the closest states in the entire country, and that is what ended up happening. It is going to be tilt red on the map, even though the polling data had it as tilt blue. And then in Illinois, I mean, this is just an absolute joke, Kamala Harris's performance. The last three Democratic nominees, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden, they all won Illinois by the exact same 17-point margin. But look at what Kamala Harris does when she enters the scene. She wins it by just 8 points. 8 to 9, I think it's at around 9 now. But, I mean, looking at this margin, this is just absolutely abysmal. 8.6% in a state where the last three Democratic nominees pulled off victories 2 times as large, even though the polls had her winning by nearly 20. And so Illinois is barely going to be even likely blue based on the final results. Next up, in Michigan, Donald Trump actually does better in Michigan than in Wisconsin. He's the first Republican to do that in the last 4 to 5 election cycles. The former president was actually supposed to lose the Wolverine state. This was the other race where the polls had Kamala Harris winning, but Trump ultimately came out on top. He won it by 1.4%. So the polling data had Michigan as being tilt blue, but ultimately it was lean red. And then in Ohio, Trump did well here as well, just like in Iowa. The former president was supposed to win by 9.3. He ultimately carried it by 11.3, right below the threshold for a race to be solid. And then in Pennsylvania, this is the state where Trump is going to perform the best in the blue wall compared to Wisconsin and Michigan, exactly as I predicted. Donald Trump is going to win Pennsylvania by 2%. It's going to be lean red, even though according to the RCP average, he was only going to carry the Keystone State by 0.4. Yet another example. There's only been one state so far where Kamala Harris actually did better than the polling, and that is when she outperformed polls in Minnesota by 0.2%. Everywhere else, she's done significantly worse than what the polling data said. And so Pennsylvania, based on the data, was supposed to be tilt red. Ultimately, it was well within the lean category. And then now moving up to New York and New Jersey, I mean, Democrats took an absolute beating here, and the best part was that nobody even expected it, although I did make videos about how New York was going to be incredibly competitive this time around, and ultimately I would say I was proven to be correct. Polling had Kamala Harris winning by nearly 20 points. The two final polls, one of them conducted by the New York Times and Siena College, the other one by a Republican pollster, they both had Harris leading by just under a 20-point margin. She ultimately wins the Empire State state by 11.6. It's not even solid. This is the worst performance for any Democrat in New York since 1988. It's only going to be likely blue on our map, even though polls had it as pretty solid for the vice president. In New Jersey, disaster strikes again. I mean, Kamala Harris, the Joy candidate, was supposed to win New Jersey by nearly 15 to 20 points. It was supposed to be the regular, respectable Democrat margin. I mean, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden both won New Jersey by around 15 points in the last two cycles. But what does the vice president do? She comes in and she carries New Jersey by 6. 6 out of 15. That is over a 10-point shift to the right in one of the most liberal states in the entire country. New Jersey now is going to be considered competitive in all future elections, especially in 2028. It could even potentially flip. And so based on the final results, it is well within the likely category. It's actually very close even to being put in lean. Up in New Hampshire, Kamala Harris was supposed to win by 4.2. She ultimately won by just 2.8. I mean, incredibly competitive. Joe Biden carried the Granite State by 7.4 in the last election. So it's going to be lean blue. Once again, an underperformance on Harris's part. And then up in Maine, the state as a whole, the vice president was supposed to win by around 12 to 13 points. That was obviously impossible. Right now, she leads by 9.1, but there is ranked choice voting, and it's going to take some time for that to get sorted out. But it's probably going to fall within the likely range. Definitely not solid blue. Meanwhile, in the second district, Donald Trump carried it by a huge 9-point margin. It was a clear victory, even though the polls actually had him losing at one point. Not any of them had Trump winning by anywhere near 9 points. And so once again, another huge underestimation of the former president. In Virginia, we have the second state on this map where Kamala Harris outperformed expectations. She wins by 5.2. Even though the polls had her winning by just 5. Once again, she outperforms expectations by 0.2%. I mean, that means literally nothing. The RCB average had her up by 5. She wins by 5.2. Literally no difference, but I did expect her to perform better here. I did think she would actually outdo the polling average, but ultimately she wins by just half of Joe Biden's 10-point margin from 4 years ago, and Virginia is barely scraping by as likely blue. Down in North Carolina, this was a race I expected to be a lot closer than it ultimately was. I had it as a tilt state. I had Trump winning by around 1% just because of Mark Robinson and the negative impact he's had on the Trump campaign in the Tar Heel state, but ultimately Trump proves everyone wrong again. The polling had him up by 1.2%. Trump wins by 3.3, his largest margin since 2016. This is a strong performance from the former president. And so North Carolina, it was supposed to be barely above the lean threshold based on the polling, but ultimately it was well within the category. Down in Georgia, even though the polls had Trump leading by a pretty comfortable margin, he was supposed to win by 1.3%. He ultimately won by 2.2. Once again, outperforming expectations. There's no surprises here at all. That's what he's done in 2016, 2020, and now for the third time in a row. So Georgia is also going to be lean red. And then finally, in Florida, I mean, a big surprise here. Trump was supposed to carry the state by 8. Ultimately, he carries it by a solid 13.1% margin. I don't think anyone expected him to do just this well. I did say he could probably win the Sunshine State by a double-digit margin, but 13 points was not something I quite expected. I mean, Republicans really are just dominating in Florida, and so the state is actually going to be a solid red, even though the polls had it as just being likely. And so based on the expected final results, there are still some states that are counting a small portion of votes, and I'm going to give you guys a full update when all of that is done. But in terms of the margin ranges, it's pretty much going to be exactly what you're seeing on the screen here. 312, 226. Donald Trump wins 6 of the 7 battleground states by 1% or more. It's basically almost exactly what we had been predicting, what we had been telling you guys on this channel over the past, I mean, really 3 to 4 months, basically since Kamala Harris jumped into the race. The only tilt state, the only state decided by less than 1% in Wisconsin, a lot less than what we saw in 2020 when there were 3 states decided by a tilt margin. But again, this could not have been a better performance for Donald Trump. For the third election in a row, he outperforms everyone's expectations. He wins in a modern day landslide. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe right now for more content like this over the next 4 years.